Well, I'm not getting any responses, so maybe people aren't entirely sure. But for me, oh, Diane, are you going to answer?
Is it Africa?
It's Africa. That's right. And as Judith, Judith stole my thunder a little bit, but this is the region I was hoping people would think about, the Serengeti of Africa, right? When you think of these iconic animal migrations, these massive mixed species groups of ungulates, these apex predators like lions and cheetahs and such, in my mind that always initially evokes Africa. But the amazing thing is that Africa, I would argue, paled in comparison to what used to be what I would call the American Serengeti. So the Great Plains of North America it still is an incredibly impressive place, but it was home to probably the most prodigious animal migrations and predator communities in the world. There's a staggering diversity of megafauna throughout the Great Plains. And this was true up until the late Pleistocene, which was about 10,000 years ago. This particular area of the world was one of the most diverse communities in the world that rivaled, or many would argue would surpass the current African Serengeti. You had species like the North American cheetah that you see on the bottom here, and some of you might be familiar with the pronghorn or the American antelope. The pronghorn is the fastest mammal in the Americas, and the reason it's so fast is because it had to outrun this extinct species of cheetah. So just think about that. It's kind of hard to imagine, but think about southeastern Colorado with cheetahs roaming and mastodons and Columbian mammoths. And the suite of species doesn't stop there. It also extends to species like giant ground sloths, the American lion, you name it. So again, this incredible menagerie used to characterize the Great Plains of North America. Now, in the late Pleistocene, and it's pretty firmly established in the scientific literature. During this particular period of time, many of these animals were hunted to extinction. And so, in the absence of many of these species, other species were able to proliferate and were able to take advantage of that sort of open niche space, that ecological opportunity, to attain absolutely tremendous abundances. So some of the species include predators like wolves and grizzly bears. It is thought that at the height of their population, there were probably about 50,000 grizzly bears on the Great Plains. And for wolves, that number soars to 500,000, right? So for me, when I often think of wolves, I think of the Rocky Mountains. I think of areas like Yellowstone, places that, are these large preserves, often mountainous areas, as sort of the center of wolf habitat. But the reality is that the wolves' center of abundance was on the Great Plains, out in these massive, open, flowing prairies. So these thought exercises, I think, are always interesting and I think it's important to think about the history to see where we started and kind of where we're going. In addition, there were massive herds of ungulates, the bison being the best example. So the American bison is the largest terrestrial mammal in the Americas. Males can attain sizes of over 2,200 pounds or over a ton in weight. And at the height of their population, these bison were thought to number anywhere between 30 to 60 million bison, just prodigious numbers of biomass and grazers on the Great Plains. And of course, at the Southern Plains Land Trust, we're big fans of prairie dogs. So an additional example is the largest prairie dog colony ever recorded was recorded in the Panhandle of Texas, and this was recorded in the 1800s, and it was estimated to be 100 miles wide, 250 miles long, with 400 million individual prairie dogs. So again, just sort of evokes the grandeur of this ecosystem. Now, this isn't a fully happy story. In post Civil War, or sorry, I guess I should speed up to did I miss this slide here? So after the Civil War was over, the government and the American people turned towards westward expansion. And in these realms, there were a variety of indigenous tribes who coexisted with these animals. They hunted these animals. They lived sustainably in relationships with a lot of these animals like bison and wolves and grizzly bears. But in the onslaught of Western expansion, and particularly after the Civil War, starting in the late 1860s, America's eye turned westward, and these areas of the country that used to be the home of many of the tribes that Judith mentioned, the Kiowa, the Comanche, they started to become inundated with settlers who were colonizing from the eastern North America. And with this wave of colonization came one of the greatest episodes or extended bouts of wildlife destruction in modern history of the world, I would argue. Um, this included indigenous displacement, it included homesteading, sod busting, so breaking up the millions of years of topsoil that had been deposited on the prairie, overgrazing by too many livestock, riparian deforestation, wildlife persecution. The list goes on. And these are just a few of the examples of how westward expansion impacted the ecological communities of the Great Plains. And this all culminated in the 1930s with the Dust Bowl. So in the 1920s, it was a very moist decade, and there was a boom in agriculture, and people flooded into this area that you see here: southeastern Colorado, Kansas, the panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas, and northeastern New Mexico. These are the southern plains. And this was the epicenter of the Dust Bowl. So in the 30s, the combination of sod busting, which had destroyed millions and millions upon millions of acres of shortgrass prairie and also mixed grass prairie, combined with the very dry years and the extreme drought in the 1930s, resulted in the Dust Bowl. And one of the classic examples of the Dust Bowl is Black Sunday, which was on April 14th, 1935. This is a picture taken by a photographer on that day. But this is just one of thousands of dust storms that occurred during the 1930s that absolutely devastated human populations and agriculture, and is probably the largest wholesale destruction of wildlife and habitat in modern American history, as I mentioned. So this sort of sets the stage for where we are at now. But really quickly, um, after the 1930s, Roosevelt came in. He basically mobilized the government to essentially save this area of the country. This is where a lot of American agricultural subsidization started. You had the formation of soil conservation districts and national grasslands. So there were a lot of people who were trying to make sure that this didn't happen again. But there were also some negatives, right? So there was widespread defaunation, of which we're still trying to recover today. There was a loss of many of the keystone species that were critically important to the health of this ecosystem of the Great Plains, and tremendously impaired ecological function. And even today, even in the areas surrounding us now, there is still continued agriculture and overgrazing. So the same problems that we faced many years ago, albeit on a slightly smaller scale, are still occurring today. Um, so that's where the Southern Plains Land Trust comes in. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of our organization. The Southern Plains Land Trust was founded in 1998 by some grad students from the Colorado University Boulder, who wanted to create a refuge for prairie wildlife. I should mention that the prairie in the United States is one of the least protected ecosystems on Earth. Less than 1% of it is formally protected, and more than 50% of it in this agricultural kind of matrix has actually been destroyed. So we only have about half of the original prairie left over. And the Southern Plains Land Trust came in to try to remedy the situation. And it was founded by Nicole Rose Marino, who is currently still on our board and was the executive director for the last 11 years. She's the shoes that I'm filling, and I strive every day to do as Nicole would do. And the mission of SPLT is to create a network of shortgrass prairie preserves across the Southern Plains. And currently, we have multiple preserves. These are just three of the larger ones that we protect, that we own in fee. So this includes Heartland, which is about 43,000 acres, Raven's Nest, which is about 5,000 acres, and Fresh Tracks, which is a little over or about 2,000 acres. So and we also protect other areas as well. But this is just an example of how this organization has grown since its foundation about 25 years ago. And just some concrete examples of what SPLT has accomplished in our progress for the prairie. We've actually protected 60,000 acres. So this graph that you see right here is showing the amount of land protected by SPLT since about 2010, so only in the last 12, 13 years. And you can see how this has been growing, and it's actually been growing almost exponentially. Under the leadership of Nicole and our tremendous board, many of whom are here today. So kudos to you guys. Some highlights of SPLT is that we have a bison herd, and it's not a herd used for meat production as 90% of bison are in North America. It's actually a conservation herd. So we hope to grow this herd and have bison roam free again on the shortgrass prairie of southeastern Colorado. We have 2,500 prairie dog acres at Heartland, and we have recently in 2022 become a black-footed ferret recovery site. The black-footed ferret I'll talk about in a little bit, but it's one of the most, probably the most endangered terrestrial mammal in North America. So these are just a few examples of what we have achieved at Split in the last 25 years. Now, we're going to jump into the present day and talk about what we currently do at Split and some of our terrestrial biodiversity before I pass it off to Judith. And we'll talk a little bit about grasslands. So I mentioned the Great Plains, and this is sort of a historic distribution of the Great Plains. So it stretches all the way from Canada, southern Saskatchewan, Alberta, all the way down to southern Texas, and even into parts of Mexico as well. And you can see here that there are kind of three different categories of prairie: tall grass, mixed grass, and short grass. And a lot of that is simply driven by precipitation. So in areas that you see here with tall grass prairie, which are farther east, those areas receive more rainfall. The grass is able to grow higher, and hence you have tall grass prairie. And as you move farther and farther west, and you can see where we are at Split in southern Colorado, we're kind of at the drier extent of this gradient of precipitation. So that's why we have short grass prairie here. It's usually maximum about knee height compared to about chest height in tall grass prairie. And again, a lot of that is driven by precipitation. Prairies are defined by what you don't see. So this is an example of some different prairie plants. But what you'll notice here is sort of a tip of the iceberg type of analogy, I think is an apt analogy. You see that most of the biomass on prairies is underground and in their root systems. And particularly in places like shortgrass prairie, where it's so dry, many of these plants rely on these deep and extensive root systems to be able to uptake water and survive in such an arid environment. Prairies have a lot of ecosystem services that are really important, not only locally but also globally. So worldwide, prairies and grasslands in general account for a third of all terrestrial carbon storage. That is a large amount of carbon. We often think of forests as carbon sinks, but grasslands are doing their fair share as well. Additionally, water filtration and purification, when you have water filtering through this fine net of roots, underground in this massive network, you're basically, it's acting as sort of a filtration system, which is really important for water quality. Nutrient cycling is really important, and habitat for biodiversity. And these are just a few different examples of why grasslands, and particularly the shortgrass prairie that we live and work in, is so important for wildlife. Grasslands are shaped by two primary processes, and these processes are fire, and they're also shaped by grazing. So as I mentioned, the native grazer of North America is the American bison that you see here on the right. And historically, there has been the importance of fire has been incredibly important for maintaining these grasslands and preventing woody encroachment and the advance of shrubs and trees into these vast seas of grass. Now, this is a problem nowadays, and one of the reasons is because fire is now largely suppressed. So, to protect our houses, to protect our resources, to protect our grazing land, humans in general have engaged in widespread fire suppression. And well, on the short term, that can prevent stuff from being damaged. In the long term, it's part of the reason why across North America and worldwide, we've been seeing more extreme and larger extent fires, is because when you don't suppress them and there finally is a fire, it affects a much larger area of land. Additionally, as many of us know, our native grazers, the bison, at the height of their destruction, they were only numbering about 300 or so individuals left in the entire country in all of North America. Now they're back at about 400,000 or 500,000, but again, 90% of those are used for meat production and are sort of ranch, similar to cattle. And what we have in most of the grasslands across the Great Plains are cows, which are non-native grazers and are not as well adapted to living in these systems. So I want to quickly talk about why bison are so important. Why do we have a herd of 100 bison? Bison serve a lot of important ecological purposes. A couple of different examples are they create habitat heterogeneity. So bison move around a lot more than cattle, and Judith will talk about this later in relation to water. But because they move around so much and they graze sort of sporadically where they move, they create a matrix of heterogeneous grassland. And having different heights of grass and different species of grass has a huge benefit for a lot of other wildlife, especially birds, which are one of my personal favorites. Additionally, bison are associated with higher plant and animal diversity. So studies that have compared cow and bison find that whenever bison are around, you actually have a much more diverse plant community. Bison selectively browse; they prefer some plants over others, and what that does is it creates more local biodiversity, whereas cows would just kind of graze everything and leave behind a very low biodiversity ecosystem in their wake. Plants or grasslands that have bison grazing on them are shown to have greater drought resistance because grasses use shallower soil water than forbs or other shrubs. And additionally, bison are known to be ecosystem engineers. So the physical impacts they have on the ecosystem have huge impacts, cascading impacts on biodiversity. The wallows that bison create by rolling around in the grass, there are these kind of bare depressions in the grassland, those fill with water and provide habitat for amphibians. Bison will rub on trees or junipers that they find in the grassland, and they'll often end up girdling them and killing them, which prevents woody encroachment. So these are just, again, a few examples. I could go on for a long time about bison, but there's a variety of reasons why bison are keystone species and ecosystem engineers. And simply having them present on the landscape is a huge step forward towards restoring some of these degraded or damaged grassland ecosystems. I want to talk about another ecosystem engineer, which are the prairie dogs. So, the prairie dogs consist of 5 different species distributed throughout North America. You can see that here on the left. The species that we have on split land is the black-tailed prairie dog. So, they, as you can see, they're the farthest east and they have the largest distribution, both east to west and north to south. And these are colony living rodents. So, these prairie dogs are social. I think they have a lot of similarities to human communities personally, but they also create these burrows. They create these prairie dog towns, as they're sometimes called. And these burrows provide roosting and nesting habitat for dozens of associated species. So prairie dogs, similar to bison in their own way, are incredibly important for generating and maintaining the biodiversity that we think of when we think of an intact, healthy grassland. Now, prairie dogs have faced a lot of challenges. They've faced persecution from people. Prairie dogs and this is something I'm learning just moving out to the West, but prairie dogs are out here are by many people are hated. They're hated because they're seen as a pest that competes with cattle for forage. They're hated because they're seen as a vector of plague. So interestingly enough, this little flea you see here on the left carries Yersinia pestis, which is the exact same pathogen that caused the Black Plague of Europe in the Middle Ages. That flea has been brought over and affects a lot of mammals in North America, including the prairie dog and their obligate predator, the black-footed ferret that you see at the top here. So because of human persecution and because of this plague that's caused by this introduced flea, prairie dog populations have plummeted, and currently prairie dogs occupy only about 2% of their historic range. They've been drastically reduced in both distribution and in abundance. And the loss of this species, as I mentioned, has huge cascading negative impacts on the ecosystem. So there are species like the black-footed ferret up here that depend on prairie dogs for food. And when the prairie dogs disappear, the black-footed ferrets disappear. It's why they're the most endangered mammal in North America, with only 340 individuals left in the wild currently. When you lose that impact of clipping grasses and vegetation, you end up getting reduced nitrogen. You get reduced forage quality, which means that big animals like bison will use that area less. You get reduction in all of these other things that then cause species like the mountain plover, which depend on prairie dogs for roosting and breeding. They decline. So burrowing owls over here on the right. When you lose prairie dogs, you lose a number of active burrows. You lose habitat for species like burrowing owls that will use these prairie dog holes to put their nests in. So just a few examples, but because of all of these impacts that prairie dogs have in other species, they're sort of at the crux of Split's management approach and strategy for trying to restore this prairie to its former glory. Quickly had to do a mention of some grassland birds. Grassland birds are the most declining guild of birds in North America. So it's been estimated, and this is from a science paper that came out about 4 or 5 years ago, that more than 720 million grassland birds have been lost since 1970. Just to scale that up, that's about 53% of all grassland birds. And species like the western meadowlark or eastern meadowlark that you see here, are basically 1 in 4 of what their abundance used to be. And a lot of this is due to habitat loss, right? It's due to crop production. It's due to woody encroachment because you don't have these former, forces of bison and fire acting on the landscape to maintain the grassland. So there's a couple things we can do to slow and reverse the declines. And a couple examples of what we do at Split is we have a Motus tower. So that Motus tower that you see in the background, don't mind the tarantula in the foreground, is a tower that actually detects birds that either spend time here or pass by. So anything that passes within about 10 or 15 miles of this tower gets pinged, and we get a record of the birds that are using this habitat. And we found that tons of species of birds, including many of the threatened and endangered grassland birds, depend on the habitat we have at Split to be able to survive. Additionally, I mentioned the importance of bison and prairie dogs in our management strategies. Simply having both of these species on the landscape and trying to expand their populations is going to have huge positive impacts on birds and a variety of other wildlife. And lastly, of course, most importantly, we need to continue buying and protecting more prairie. The loss of habitat to cropland is probably the single biggest threat to grassland birds and to prairie wildlife in general. Now, everybody loves some ungulates, so I show a couple of the ones that we have here on Split's preserves. The mule deer that you see here on the left, and also the famous pronghorn that I mentioned earlier, North America's fastest mammal. These are a couple of the amazing ungulates that we have here. And one of the big problems facing ungulates is fences. So this is a graphic picture. I apologize, but I think it really hits home the reality of what barbed wire fences can do to wildlife. It can kill these ungulates, especially pronghorn. Interestingly enough, pronghorn cannot jump well because they're so fast. They do not have the musculature to jump well. And that's all because of this former relationship with the now extinct North American cheetah. So they usually try to climb under fences. And as a result, they often get caught and die, as you see with this radio-collared pronghorn here. So at Split, we do fence removal. And this is just a map from one recent project that we completed this past year. You can see all of the blue there is new fence added. So this is all fence that's wildlife friendly. It has smooth top and bottom wires, which allow pronghorn to go under and deer to go over. And the bottom wires lift up to 18 inches, which allows those pronghorn to just easily scoot under and prevents these graphic injuries that you just saw. We've also modified some fence, and we've also removed a lot of the interior fence. And our ultimate goal is to remove pretty much all of the interior fence and make this one contiguous wildlife preserve that allows these animals, such as bison and other ungulates, to have their migratory movements that they so desperately need. So with that kind of covers the terrestrial ecology, and I'm happy to pass it back along to Judith, my co-director, who's going to talk about the aquatic side of the story.
Thanks, Henry. I learned a lot. No, I already knew those things, but there's only so much you can cover in 20 minutes. Let's see. Yes, so I'll be covering the aquatic side of the story. People often think about this region as very dry and barren and a very monotonous landscape, but actually we have a lot of streams traversing through each one of our preserves, as you can see from these aerial maps. People are still entering the call. That's great. On Heartland alone, we have 57 miles of stream. So and each one of these preserves have their own characteristics, and where there's water, there's life. So these waterways are definitely hotspots of biodiversity, and I want to tell you a little bit more about them. Here we go. So we have different bodies of water, different water resources on our preserves, and I'll cover the 4 major ones. We have streams, intermittent and perennial streams. Intermittent means that they are not wet year-round. They're only flowing after a rainfall or snowmelt. And perennial means that there's water there year-round, which is more often the downwater areas of the stream. Our Heartland Preserve is so large that we have waterways that originate on mesas on our preserve and flow all the way north towards the Arkansas River. We do not have the Arkansas River on our preserve, but close enough. It covers a large section of the entire Mud Creek and Angry Creek streams. The current issues that we have with these streams is that there's a lot of stream bank erosion due to cattle drinking. I wanted to say cattle grazing, but they're actually drinking from the streams, which results in erosion and poor water quality. Then we have springs. We have 5 springs on Heartland and 1 on Raven's Nest. They are natural springs. They're wet year round, extremely important for wildlife to get a drink. They are connected to the groundwater table level. Unfortunately, they are also excellent locations for tumbleweeds to get stuck in, which completely chokes out any light going towards the water and also the access to wildlife drinking. And in 2 of our 5 natural springs, ranchers have put in diversion pipes, which is basically like a concrete basin with tubes that flow towards a stock pond, which leads to the next body of water. We have a lot of livestock ponds on the preserves. These are man-made, dug with an excavating machine. They're very shallow, and they always have like a barrier dam that comes from the sediment from the pit, if you understand what I mean. They are either connected to a well that pumps water into them, or connected to the natural stream that when the stream flows, it flows into that pond, is basically stopped by that barrier dam and does not flow into the downstream section of where the stream used to be. Livestock ponds are incredibly inefficient because most of the water is lost to evaporation anyway, and they are basically the water level is too variable for any vegetation to settle. It's too dry for aquatic plants because it dries out really fast. It's too wet for terrestrial plants because when the rain falls or when the well pumps water, they just get drowned. And we also have a lot of stock tanks. As you can see, they're heavily trafficked by our bison. These stock tanks are connected to a network of pipes. Again, there's a lot of temperature fluctuation in these ponds, in these tanks. They get really hot midday, midsummer. They get really cold midwinter. So it's not a suitable water source for any kind of aquatic life, to sustain any aquatic life. Of course, it sustains the terrestrial species, but I'm not talking about terrestrial species. I'm talking about aquatic species. So these are the 4 main water bodies on our preserves. And I'd like to tell you now a bit about the wildlife that depends on it. First of all, let's start small, start with the insects, my favorite. That's what I did my whole PhD in. So in order to sustain decent populations of insects in your stream, and that's something that we want, we need to look a little bit at the riparian zone, something that happens above the water. The top image is what our streams mostly look like right now, and the bottom image is what we kind of want for insects to thrive. We want gradual slopes on our stream banks. We want overhanging vegetation. We want riparian trees to provide shade. And the stream bottom should also be as heterogeneous as possible, with hopefully with some stones and some organic leaf litter that creates all these tiny microhabitats for insects. Why do we want insects? Because they are at the base of the food web. So they are essential for fish and birds. But they also provide a lot of ecosystem services. They decompose organic matter. They make the water clean. They recycle nutrients. And they are also water quality indicators. So they can tell something about how healthy the stream is. And if you know how healthy your stream is, you kind of know how healthy the rest of your ecosystem can be. We at Heartland, we know a little bit about the dragonfly and damselfly communities. We have these 12-spotted skimmers and flamed skimmers, but we do not know a lot about the rest of the benthic invertebrate community. So we are going to do a comprehensive survey sometime in the next year or this year. And what we're looking for are these mayflies, caddisflies, and stoneflies, because these are the species that will tell us that our stream is healthy. And I suggest everyone who wants to know more about these aquatic insects to Google the second resource here, ArcGIS Story Map, Colorado benthic macroinvertebrates. It tells a great story about how important these species are and the policies that are in place in Colorado to help these. Next up are the amphibians, a little bit larger than insects, depending on insects though. We have definitely seen these 6 species, and it's always surprising to me to think of this dry region and then to think of an animal that depends on water, right? They have such sensitive skin. They literally cannot survive in drought. So these animals are doing an amazing job. We have salamanders, frogs, toads, and I'm going to focus on the plains leopard frog right now because that's a species of concern, a priority species for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. As you can see, the northern leopard frog is fairly common all throughout the state of Colorado, but the plains leopard frog, we're right at kind of the border of its habitat. We are, for those who are not familiar here, we are in the bottom right county, Bend and Baca counties of Colorado. So we are doing our best to help these plains leopard frog thrive. We have the right conditions here. We have our natural springs is where we see them. The springs are wet year round. They keep a water depth all throughout the year so that they do not boil or freeze. We are reducing nitrogen loading from cow dung and all the other things are in place to kind of sustain and expand this population of plains leopard frogs. And then the most interesting slide of this talk, I'm sorry, Henry. No, I'm just kidding. This is, I don't know if people have been following our social media, but we were lucky enough to find a beaver dam a couple weeks ago on Heartland. We had already found a beaver dam on Raven's Nest Preserve a little while ago, but now, right now, there's a little scoop in this video that we haven't told anyone yet. I hope you can see what I mean. So there are two beavers, and that's great news. It's not one lonely beaver. It's either a couple or a parent with a juvenile. That's a bit unclear. But as you can see, this beaver didn't need wooden logs to construct a beaver dam. It uses grass, mud, and even bits of Russian thistle to construct its dam and its burrow. And why are we so happy about? Why are we so happy that the beaver likes our preserve? Well, that's because beavers are keystone species and also ecosystem engineers. So an ecosystem engineer, as Henry explained before, is an animal that has the ability to adapt its habitat and create an entirely new ecosystem that not only supports itself, but also a lot of other species. And especially beavers are important in this ecosystem because what we have right now, and this image kind of shows what can happen to your landscape when you have this colonization of beavers and beaver dams. Right now, we're at this stage where we have a lot of erosion due to cattle grazing or overgrazing. We have a lot of soil loss. We see deep and narrow channels. And what we want in the future is this side of the image, the right side, where water is slowed down, sticks around in the system for longer, where, let me move this, the water and the sediment is allowed to sink into the stream bank, elevate that water table, and also that the water can even seep down into the groundwater, maybe even back into the aquifer. We want the water to spread, so more vegetation is able to thrive and live. We want the water stored and shared with a bunch of other species. So we're extremely excited to see this beaver. The question is this beaver surviving, barely hanging on, or is it like really enjoying our habitat? That's the question. And I think we have quite a little bit of work to do before this our habitat is really good enough for many other beavers. Okay, I'll talk about aquatic restoration from now on because we have very ambitious plans in the next couple of years. We, with a bunch of experts, we designed a map with priority locations and priority activities in terms of restoration. And luckily, the good news is that 2 days ago, we heard that we are receiving a grant to do the majority of this work. So that's extremely exciting for us. We will have the funds to actually do this and make our waterways better. But first, the first thing we did was relieve the grazing pressure. Studies have shown time and time again that grazing livestock damages streams, waterways, water quality, etc. 80% of damage in this region of the United States is from grazing livestock. Grazing changes channel morphology, compacts the soil, it increases erosion, and we have cattle here, bison, but there are significant differences between cows and bison. One first of is behavioral. Cows linger. So where bison are constantly on the move, cows go to the stream and they just hang out for the rest of the day. They also drink a lot more water than bison. And what they do, they drink, they trample the soil. Soil gets too compact for any kind of vegetation to pop up, and they poop in the stream. So water quality is poor. And other studies even showed that bison have a very low reliance on streams for their water intake. They rely on puddles and wallows that fill up with water, and even they get more moisture from eating grass than cows do. A final thing that I want to mention in this cow versus bison comparison, the average cattle density in the state of Colorado is 1 cow per 30 acres, and we have currently 1 bison per 430 acres. So we have completely relieved that grazing pressure from our landscape, which allows us to move on to other aquatic restoration activities, such as one rock dams. We built these one rock dams. They are called one rock dam because they are about the height of one rock. We built these in our headwaters where there's still a lot of erosion happening. And these little, small, quite low dams are not meant to stop water runoff. They're just meant to slow down the water. And when the water is slow, it has time to, the sediment in the water has time to sink down and fill up those erosion pits. And as you can see here in a picture with Jay, our preserve manager, these one rock dams fill up with vegetation and plants and other kinds of sediment. So these two are successful, and next step is to build another one rock dam on top of that to actually completely heal the landscape. What we also do is we build log jams or beaver dam analogs. That's what the BDA stands for. These are structures we put into very deep, narrow channels. It's a pile of logs, again, not meant to stop the water. It's meant to slow down the water for that sediment to settle and the stream to kind of widen and water to get stored in those riparian zones, which makes it easier for grass and other riparian species to settle. And as you can see on the right, that's exactly what it's doing here. And hopefully when the water comes, it also kind of creates a little bit of a beaver-like system. Another one of our activities is spring cleanups. well, like I said before, they fill up completely with tumbleweeds, and we want it to be open. We want the water to be accessible to wildlife and for other native flora to grow in there as well. So I've got a little video of one of our controlled burns in the spring, one of the, it's called dripping springs, and tumbleweed burns very fast. So that's we are going to clean up each one of our springs that's choked out by tumbleweed. Sorry. Another one, another aquatic restoration activity is cottonwood and coyote willow replantings along the riparian zone. It has been done before, many times before, on our preserves. It's a restoration activity that we really like. It's not always been super successful. We think that's due to a combination of factors. Groundwater level could definitely be an inhibitor in terms of how well these cottonwood seedlings are able to settle. But I got another little video of our founder Nicole, who is planting cottonwoods. I won't show the whole video, but this was 4 years ago during COVID, and they had to do everything by themselves.
Hi there, this is Nicole with the Southern Plains Land Trust, and we are at one of our favorite spots on Heartland Ranch called the West Spring. And I'll show you, it's got year-round water. We have, see that nice little pool, beautiful rock formations. And this is really important for prairie wildlife. And what we're doing here is planting cottonwood trees. We picked them up yesterday from the extension office in Springfield, Colorado. And you can see there's lots of lush riparian vegetation, and I'll take you on a little tour since you can't be here due to the COVID-19. We are not having volunteers plant this year for their own safety and health. Instead, it's me and Jay Tushton, the preserve manager. And this is super cool in that this is a cottonwood that we planted here 2 years ago. And so it is alive. We had volunteers and neighbors out in spring of 2018, and we're super excited that this.
Well, that's at least, as you can see, some of them are sprouting and surviving. So that's optimistic. Final aquatic restoration activity that I want to mention is that we are going to remove some of our stock ponds, and we're breaking the dams. We're reconnecting those ponds to the original hydrology as it's supposed to be, the stream flowing through the landscape, not being inhibited by these barriers. And what you can see from the left image, this is Heartland, and all of these white dots are stock dams, stock ponds, and all of these black dots are stock tanks, the metal structures that provide water to livestock. And it's incredible to see how this landscape is made for livestock, right? It's so there's so many anthropogenic influences that we are desperate to restore things to the natural way. So one thing about stock ponds is that they're incredibly inefficient. Like I mentioned before, 64% of the water in this pond, it just evaporates. 31% goes into the ground, and then only 3% is actually the livestock gets to drink. So what we do is we need a machine to break the dam, reconnect it to the floodplain. Well, this is one of my final slides. What is in the future? The future depends on wise decisions, being able to perform specific restoration activities, and a lot of time, of course, time for the landscape to heal. We could have the left image, when I'm talking about the waterways, that is moist, biodiverse, lots of species, a carbon sink where carbon is captured by plants and trees. Or we could have a very dry and overgrazed desert type of ecosystem. It all depends on whether the aquifer dries out, whether certain political decisions are made, if people start plowing again in this region, going back to like a Dust Bowl kind of era, or if people continue to overgraze their land. This could be in the future. And I made these images with AI. So this bone structure is not a real animal. These are not photographs. This is what the computer thought of when I typed in specific directions for a potential future. In order for us to have more of an image like this, green, lush, and biodiverse, we need your support. We depend largely on donations and grants. And I would please want to invite you to look at our website, southernplains.org, and sign up for our monthly newsletter. I would also really like to invite you for our Toast to the Prairie. It's an event, very laid back event on June 29th. That's when we celebrate the prairie. It's just an afternoon filled with prairie stories and sharing the passion for the prairie. You're also welcome to come volunteer. We need people to remove fences, build one rock dams, and plant seedlings. Share our mission with others, and we also appreciate any type of donation. And I'd like to ask Henry to come back to answer any questions that anyone might have. Feel free to put something in the chat or raise your hand. I see here. I see Diane. Let's see if we can make this larger. Can I? Diane, can you unmute? Do you?
I'm unmuted.
Good. Ask your question. Go ahead.
So I'm curious, is the lands that you are purchasing, are they protected in any way from incursion from the
Absolutely.
ranchers and the cattle and all that?
They
So
are.
they can't just go in and put more fences up or do anything like that. It's all protected.
We protect 60,000 acres. 50,000 of those we own in fee, which means that, you know, it's our land, and the others we protect with similar easements, which a conservation easement is essentially the prohibition or restriction of a particular activity. So on our preserves, we restrict activities like commercial grazing, right? We don't have cattle. We restrict activities like hunting and things like that. So it literally is a refuge for the wildlife. And the easements that we put in place protect these properties and lands in perpetuity. So that means forever, this will be a wildlife refuge. Yeah.
Thank you. Great presentation, by the way.
Thanks.
Diane. I see Patrick has also raised his hand. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
I should be unmuted. Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. I guess one of my questions is, in the surrounding lands, how much of it has been plowed or broken, and how much of it remains, you know, in native cover, so that it's, you know, so what kind of you know, problems are you going to look at if you want to expand the reserves? Where are you going to run into problems if you want to expand the current reserves?
Very good question. Do you want me to take that one? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the question was, you know, what's the land use around us? So it varies locally, right? And the place that we're at is actually, a lot of the prairie here is thought to be relatively well preserved, which is a counterpoint to this region, right? If you saw early in the talk where we had the graph of the Dust Bowl that showed the extent of it, southeastern Colorado was pretty close to the heart of the Dust Bowl. But that being said, the particular areas where we are have largely been cattle ranches for 100 to 150 years. So that grassland, although it's a simplified grassland because of overgrazing for such a long period of time, a lot of that has never been sod busted or put in crop production. Now, that being said, you know, you can travel 10, 20 miles and you see farms, right? And so I think that in the broader region and in our area of operation, there's plenty of land that's in crops, and that certainly poses an impediment to our mission. But in terms of immediate expansion opportunities, because we're in an area that's largely cattle grazing around us, our strategy has been to try to focus on our current preserves and expanding those bit by bit. And I think it's been very effective. And that's what we'll continue to do moving forward. And ultimately, it would be great to get more connectivity at the landscape level to allow some of these large ungulates to make their migratory movements over large spatial scales, and just connect some of these isolated preserves. So long term, our goal is to try to create a network that is connected and that can allow for animal movement and increased refuge space.
Thanks.
Are there? Let's see. Andrew.
Hey, Andrew.
Go ahead.
Hey, Henry. Yeah, thanks both of y'all for a great talk. I was wondering if you could comment on like outreach and engagement with local communities around the areas where you're buying preserves. Coming from the American Prairie System, where I'm familiar, there's been a lot of tension in the communities around there. How are you engaging with the agricultural folks around there and kind of emphasizing the ways that like protected areas can be a benefit to agricultural communities as well?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. I think that we have tried. Go ahead. Yeah.
No. I think so. We do have a lot of contact with our direct neighbors. Jay especially is really good in reaching out to the neighbors. He's been here many years. We also like to go to local fairs with our information stand and kind of just talk to the people here. But I think the really exciting thing that's going to happen is that we want to open a nature hub in the near future in Las Animas, which is like a closer town, like an hour away from us, but at least that's approachable for people to actually see a little bit of a prairie ecosystem where we can have an environmental education program with children, young adults, other people from the community. So exciting things are starting to happen. We do not have a visitor center like American Prairie has yet, because we just didn't have the funds. We're also quite far away from society where people have a hard time really coming out here. It's just like too far away for them.
I would also add that with our local neighbors, we have really good relationships. We've done mutual fencing projects with 6 of our neighbors. So that involves taking down dangerous barbed wire fence and putting up wildlife friendly fence. And, in the immediate neighborhood, I think we have really good interactions and relationships. And I think, as Judah said, it's always our goal to strive towards, getting more community engagement and doing more community oriented conservation. So.
Thanks a bunch. Love to hear that. And yeah, looking forward to a nature center in the future.
Come visit. We'll see you soon.
Let's see. Are there any other questions? We're also like exactly 1 hour in. So I think I would just like to thank everyone for attending. We hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to email us. Check out our website if you want more information. And yeah, thanks for
No, Rich has a question.
Oh, Rich, go ahead.
Actually, my question was very, very much related to the last question, and that was, it seems to me that Goldfarb in his book talked about how there were cattle ranchers who were beginning to understand the value of preserving their watershed by bringing in beavers and fencing off the stream beds. And I'm just wondering, he was really talking about that he thought that about 50% of the cattle ranchers were buying into beavers and about 50% weren't. So my question is there any effort to go out and go to Grange meetings or meetings of these ranchers and talking to them about whether they might be willing to undertake a project on their own private lands? I'm under the impression that it's possible that in some of these ranches, they're having to bring in feed and they're having to bring in water, and even in some of these areas in the western United States, cattle ranching is not a viable way to is just not economically viable because of the degradation of the farmland, and that actually beavers could actually restore the utility of the farmland to cattle ranchers. I understand it's a bigger problem with people who have agriculture because these beavers are evidently hearing the water flow in the aqueducts and stopping those up and flooding agricultural land. But is it possible that reaching out to the cattle ranchers around you, that they might actually be interested in a trial of putting a beaver on their own property?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, Rich, and it's a really incisive kind of commentary. And I think that, it's definitely true. First of all, cattle ranching is becoming economically more challenging. And part of that is because of the vicissitudes of nature in this incredibly dry part of the country, coupled with long-term overgrazing, right? And mistreatment of the land. So, over the long term, these riparian areas have been so degraded that the land stops being able to produce as much, that you're having to supplement with food and water, like you said. And I do think that there are some ranchers, I don't know if I would say 50-50 here. I think it's more in a case by case basis, but there are neighbors who have had beaver on their land before in years ago. And they were okay with it. And I think that some of the ranchers, as you said, do realize that, this is important for the hydrological health of the system and more importantly for their business. So I do think there's possibilities there. One thing that we're really excited about is we're working with about 35 other partners right now, and we're co-leading an effort to form what's called a regional partnership. So this is a diverse set of groups that represent environmental education, conservation, agriculture across the board. And the goal for this is to try to form a coalition that's going to make a unified approach towards conservation, outdoor recreation, land management in areas. And I think that'll be a way to engage. We already have several local ranchers who have agreed to be part of it. And I think that'll be a way to engage more people. And as more people come in, I think some of these ideas will be able to disseminate more effectively. But I definitely think that for the long-term sustainability and climate resiliency of the region, I think beavers are an absolute imperative. The impacts they have on the system are just unparalleled by any other aquatic animal, and they bring so much health to the landscape and to the riparian systems that that's why we're working with the beavers, and we're so excited to have one on the preserve. So.
Yeah, just a follow-up question. Is it possible that the beavers that we establish at Heartland are now going to by themselves spread out and maybe begin to try and find lodging on the private lands that surround you?
I certainly hope so. And I think that, it's going to be a few years to make that happen. But, we already got a head start. And I think that in that time, we'll be able to engage with neighbors and try to gauge the viability of their population spreading. But that's the ultimate goal, right? The only appreciable beaver population in southeastern Colorado is at the John Martin Reservoir, which is about, 30-40 miles north and a little bit or northwest of us. And so, if we could increase that population and bolster that population. And again, I love this, analogy, but if you think about where the center of the beaver trade was in the 1830s, it was right here. It was at Bent's Fort, which was about 30 miles northwest of where we are right now on the Arkansas River. That was beaver central. And by 1840, they had wiped out the entire beaver population in one of the most densely populated areas in the country. So, moving back to where that is going to take a long time. But I think it's so important just for the ecosystem. Beavers, in my mind, are the answer to a lot of our problems, especially the problems that we're going to have with water in this dry region. So
great, thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Hope to be in touch, and we'll be organizing another webinar in a couple months from now. So I'll promote that on the social media.
Thanks everybody for attending. Good to see so many
friendly. Thank you so much. It was so great.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks, guys. All righty, see ya.